In old portraits, Couthon always appears gentle, often depicted with a face of startling innocence, but appearances were a mask. Behind that soft expression lay a soul that would harden into granite, driving a man who could not walk to trample over the liberties of France. That deceptive softness hid a spirit corroded by illness, transforming him into a figure who would eventually wish to dye the entire city of Lyon red with blood. The guillotine was designed to offer a swift, humane death, but for Georges Couthon, the machine would refuse to work. History records that on his final day, the national razor met the only neck it could not fit. His execution would not be a moment of justice, but a prolonged, grotesque struggle against mechanics and biology. A final horrific irony for the man who had turned the machinery of death into a bureaucratic art form. Today we will turn back the bloody pages of history to explore the story of Georges Couthon, the man who let his own pain consume his humanity. Long before he became a symbol of the revolution's ruthlessness in Paris, the story began on the quiet, misty roads of Auvergne in the mid-18th century. It is a region of extinct volcanoes, dark stone, and hardy people, a place where the earth itself feels ancient and unyielding. It was here, in the village of Orsay, that Georges Auguste Couthon was born on December the 22nd, 1755. History often categorizes the architects of the French Revolution as urban creatures, men of the Parisian salons or the bustling ports. But Couthon was a man of the provinces. He was born into the shadow of the Puy de Dôme in a world governed by the slow rhythmic cycles of the harvest and the rigid, suffocating hierarchy of the Ancien Régime. His family belonged to the lower bourgeoisie. His father, Joseph Couthon, was a notary. In the social ecosystem of pre-revolutionary France, the notary was a crucial but often invisible pivot point. They were the keepers of secrets, the writers of wills, the recorders of debts. They were men of ink and paper who saw the intimate financial struggles of their neighbors. Growing up in a notary's house, young Georges would have been surrounded by the quiet desperation of the peasantry and the haughty entitlement of the local gentry. He learned early on that the law was a weapon, usually wielded by the strong against the weak. Those who knew him as a child described a boy of startling gentleness. He was physically small, with a face that radiated a kind of soft, open intelligence. There was no hint of the tiger of the terror in the boy who roamed the volcanic hills of Orsay. He was sensitive to the suffering of animals and terrified of conflict. The local parish records and family letters paint a portrait of a youth who was almost too fragile for the harsh realities of rural life, a boy who preferred books to the hunt and silence to the brawl. As he matured, Couthon was sent to Clermont-Ferrand to study law. This was the age of enlightenment, and even in the sleepy provinces, the air was vibrating with new ideas. The works of Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu were being passed around in secret reading rooms and Masonic lodges. For a young man like Couthon, possessing a sharp mind but a sensitive soul, Rousseau was a revelation. Rousseau spoke of a natural virtue, of a world where emotion and sincerity mattered more than rank and title. Couthon drank this in. He began to fashion himself after the ideal man of sensibility, someone who feels deeply, who cries openly at injustice, and who places the heart above the cold machinations of the court. Graduating in 1785, he married Marie Brunel, a woman of simple origins. Their marriage was, by all accounts, a sanctuary of peace. Couthon was a devoted husband and later a doting father to his two sons. In his private letters, we find a man obsessed with domestic tranquility. He writes of the joy of a warm fire, the smile of his wife, and the innocence of his children. It creates a jarring dissonance with the future. How does a man who cherished the sound of a sleeping child eventually sign orders that would orphan thousands? Upon entering the bar in Clermont-Ferrand, Couthon made a choice that would define the first half of his life. A lawyer of his skill could have sought the patronage of the wealthy nobles or the powerful clergy. There was money to be made in helping the aristocracy squeeze rents from their tenants. Couthon chose the opposite path. He dedicated his practice to the little people, the illiterate farmers, the destitute widows, the victims of bureaucratic cruelty. He became a fixture in the local courts, a small but determined figure standing against the giants of the province. He did not charge the poor for his services. He worked pro bono, driven by a moral compulsion that bordered on the religious. The people of Clermont-Ferrand began to call him l'avocat des pauvres, the advocate of the poor. One famous case from this period illustrates his character. A local charitable hospital designed to care for the indigent was being defrauded by corrupt administrators who were siphoning off funds meant for bread and medicine. The administrators were powerful men, connected to the local nobility. Couthon took the case. He argued with a quiet, burning ferocity, exposing the corruption and shaming the officials in open court. He won. The funds were restored. To the beggars and the sick of Clermont, Couthon was not just a lawyer, he was a secular saint. In 1787, he was appointed to the Provincial Assembly of Auvergne. Here, he sat among the very aristocrats he often fought in court. He was polite, deferential, and soft-spoken. He believed at this stage in reform from within. He wrote a tract titled L'Aristocrate Converti, the Converted Aristocrat, in which he argued that the nobility could be saved if they simply learned to care for the people. He was a monarchist. He believed the king was a benevolent father who was simply being misled by corrupt advisors. He was a man of the center, preaching the gospel of patience. But while his mind was ascending the heights of moral philosophy, his body was preparing to drag him down into hell. The tragedy of Couthon is somatic. It is a story written in bone and nerve. Since his youth, he had complained of joint pain, attributing it to the damp mists of Auvergne. But in 1782, the pain changed. It became a predator. It started in his legs, a numbness that would turn into sharp lightning strikes of agony. He began to lose the strength in his calves. Walking became a chore, then a difficulty, then a torture. By the late 1780s, the angel of Auvergne was leaning heavily on a cane. The doctors of the 18th century were helpless against neurological disorders. They poked him, bled him, and boiled him in sulfur baths. They offered diagnoses that ranged from gout to bad humors. The most common theory, and the one that Couthon himself seemed to internalize with crushing shame, was that his condition was the result of venereal excesses in his youth. There is no historical evidence to support that Couthon was a libertine. In fact, he was known for his chastity. But the medical dogma of the time often equated physical deformity with moral failing. Couthon was made to believe that he had brought this upon himself. He was punishing himself for sins he hadn't committed. By 1791, he would lose the use of his legs entirely. But in the years leading up to the Revolution, he was in the twilight phase, the terrifying period where a man realizes he is losing his physical agency. As the political temperature of France began to rise in 1788 and 1789, Couthon was fighting a private war. While others were debating taxes and estates, he was debating whether he could stand up from his chair without screaming. The ceaseless agony did more than cripple his legs. It isolated his mind. Pain didn't turn him cruel overnight. It drained him slowly, like a candle melting into its own flame, leaving behind a cold, hard cinder of resentment. Couthon's transformation was not sudden. It was a slow calcification. As his body withered, his will hardened. If the world was going to inflict such pain on him, a man of virtue, then perhaps the world was broken. And perhaps it needed to be broken further to be fixed. When the Estates General was summoned in 1789, the tremors reached Auvergne. The structure of France was collapsing. The king, desperate for money, had opened the door to democracy, and he would never be able to close it again. Couthon, despite his deteriorating health, threw himself into the fray. He helped draft the Cahier de Doléances, lists of grievances, for his region. His writing from this time is still hopeful, but there is a new edge to it. He speaks of the rights of the people with a fervor that surprises his colleagues. But the pivotal moment, the psychological break that would sever him from the old world, occurred when he traveled to Paris as part of a delegation to meet with the king's ministers. He expected to be treated as a representative of the people. Instead, he was treated like a peasant. The courtiers at Versailles sneered at the provincial lawyer. They looked with disdain at his halting, crippled gait. He was made to wait in antechambers. He was spoken to with the dripping condescension of the aristocracy. Couthon left Versailles burning with a cold, quiet rage. He realized then that the converted aristocrat was a myth. They would never convert. They would never see him as an equal. To them, he was just a cripple from the mountains. The advocate of the poor had looked into the face of power and seen only contempt. He realized that patience, the virtue he had lectured on for years, was a trap. The poor had been patient for centuries, and it had gotten them nothing but hunger and scorn. As 1789 bled into 1790, Couthon's paralysis advanced up his thighs. He ordered the construction of a special mechanical chair, a tricycle operated by hand cranks, which would allow him to propel himself. It was a contraption of wood and leather, a visual symbol of his separation from humanity. He sat in his machine gripping the cranks, his knuckles white. He looked toward Paris, where the Bastille had fallen and the streets were alive with the chaotic energy of freedom. The angel of Auvergne was dying, and something else was struggling to be born in the wreckage of his body, leaving the mist-shrouded quiet of the provinces, for the cacophony of the capital was a physical ordeal. But for Couthon, it was a necessary pilgrimage. He was leaving behind the advocate of the poor, the gentle mediator of village disputes, and bringing with him a hardening resolve forged in isolation and pain. As his carriage rattled away from the volcanic peaks of Auvergne, moving toward the burning heart of the revolution, he was no longer just a man seeking justice. He was a man seeking retribution against a world that had broken him. The transformation was underway, and the stage was set in a city that was about to devour its own children. In October 1791, Georges Couthon arrived in Paris. He was 35 years old. He came as a newly elected deputy to the Legislative Assembly, the governing body tasked with steering France's fragile constitutional monarchy. If Auvergne was a land of silence and stone, Paris was a screaming cacophony of mud, gunpowder, and ink. The city was a living organism in the throes of a violent mutation. The narrow medieval streets were plastered with revolutionary broadsheets. The cafes buzzed with treason and philosophy, and the air smelled of sewage and desperation. For a man in Couthon's condition, Paris was a hostile environment. The city was not built for wheels. There were no sidewalks, only gutters, running down the center of cobblestone streets slick with filth. Every journey from his lodgings to the assembly was a logistical nightmare. He had to be carried over obstacles, lifted upstairs, and maneuvered through crushing crowds. He took lodgings at 366 Rue Saint-Honoré, placing him in the very heart of the political district. At first, Couthon was an enigma to his colleagues. They saw a man with a gentle face and a soft voice, whose legs were shriveled and useless. They underestimated him. They saw the wheelchair and assumed weakness. They did not notice the eyes that missed nothing. As the winter of 1791 set in, Couthon's paralysis deepened. The pain in his legs, previously episodic, became a constant screaming companion. It was during this period that he became fully dependent on his famous mechanical chair, the fauteuil à tricycle. This machine deserves attention, for it became an extension of his persona. It was an intricate device upholstered in green velvet, a color ironically associated with hope and nature, driven by two hand cranks connected to the front wheel by gears. It allowed him a semblance of autonomy on flat surfaces, but it also marked him. In a sea of standing men shouting for liberty, Couthon was the man who sat. The medical treatments of the time were brutal. Desperate for a cure, Couthon subjected himself to electrical baths, primitive shock therapy intended to revitalize his dead nerves. He was submerged in water charged with static electricity. He was blistered with hot irons. Nothing worked. The psychological impact was profound. While other revolutionaries like Danton were known for their physical vitality and booming voices, Couthon learned to command a room with silence. He learned that if he spoke softly, people would lean in. He learned that his disability made him sympathetic to the mob. He was broken, just like the system, just like them. It was on the Rue Saint-Honoré that Couthon found his mirror image. Living just down the street, at the home of the carpenter Duplay, was a lawyer from Arras named Maximilien Robespierre. The two men were natural soulmates. Both were provincial lawyers. Both were fastidious, dressing in immaculate powder and silk, even as the streets turned to rags. Both were obsessed with virtue. While Danton spent his nights in brothels and gambling dens, Robespierre and Couthon spent their evenings drinking warm milk, playing with their dogs, and discussing the purity of the soul. Couthon had a small spaniel that he adored. Robespierre had his dog Brunt. There is a chilling domesticity to the accounts of these evenings. The two future architects of the terror sitting by a fire, petting their dogs, and calmly discussing the necessity of purging the impurities of France. Robespierre saw in Couthon a man of pure intellect, uncorrupted by the flesh because the flesh had already failed him. Couthon saw in Robespierre a moral compass that never wavered. They became inseparable. When Couthon spoke in the assembly, it was often the voice of Robespierre coming from the chair. The turning point came in the summer of 1792. The king attempted to flee, was caught, and was revealed to be conspiring with foreign powers to invade France and crush the revolution. The illusion of the good king shattered. Couthon's patience snapped. He realized that as long as the king lived, he served as a beacon for every enemy of the Republic. The secular saint began to realize that to save the poor, the king had to fall. On August 10th, 1792, the mob stormed the Tuileries Palace. The Swiss guards were massacred. The monarchy was effectively abolished. Couthon was not in the streets with a pike. He was in the assembly, watching the old world burn. In September, the Legislative Assembly was dissolved and the National Convention was formed. Couthon was elected by a landslide. This was a harder, darker parliament. The time for compromise was over. It was here that Couthon made a physical move that symbolized his political shift. The convention hall was built like an amphitheater. The moderate Girondins sat on the lower levels. The radicals sat on the high benches, earning them the nickname La Montagne, the mountain. Couthon, despite the agonizing difficulty of being carried up the steep steps, insisted on sitting at the very top of the mountain, right beside Robespierre. He wanted the world to know exactly where he stood, at the summit of radicalism. The winter of 1792 brought the trial of the century. Louis XVI, now simply Citizen Louis Capet, was dragged before the convention to answer for his crimes. The moderate Girondins were terrified. They knew the king was guilty, but they feared the chaos that would follow his execution. They desperately sought a way out. They proposed a referendum, an appeal to the people. They argued that the entire nation should vote on the king's fate, a process that would take months, perhaps years, and likely save his life. It was Couthon who drove the nail into the king's coffin. On a cold day in January 1793, Couthon signaled to speak. The hall went quiet. He did not scream like Marat. He did not thunder like Danton. He spoke with the cold, precise logic of a notary. He dismantled the Girondin argument. He pointed out that the convention had been elected by the people to make difficult decisions. To send the vote back to the villages would be to invite civil war. It was a delay tactic, pure and simple. "You are not judges," Couthon told the assembly, his voice thin but cutting. "You are statesmen. You do not have a sentence to render for or against a man, but a measure of public safety to take." When the voting began, it lasted for days. Each deputy walked to the tribune to declare their vote. When Couthon's name was called, his legs were too weak to carry him to the podium. He remained in his seat. The usher brought the registry to him. Couthon looked at the paper. He did not hesitate. He wrote, "La mort sans sursis," death without delay. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was guillotined. Couthon had helped kill the father of the nation. In doing so, he crossed a psychological Rubicon. He had destroyed the ultimate authority figure. Now there was no law but the will of the convention, and the convention was beginning to eat itself. To understand why Couthon later destroyed the Girondins with such specific venom, we must look at a personal slight that occurred shortly before the king's death. Couthon had actually tried to bridge the gap between the mountain and the Girondins. He respected their intellect. But the Girondins were elitists. They looked down on the uncouth Jacobins. When the Committee of the Constitution was being formed, a prestigious body tasked with writing the new laws of France, Couthon expected a seat. He was a brilliant lawyer. He was popular. The Girondins blocked him. They whispered that a cripple could not have the stamina for such work. They mocked his infirmity behind closed doors. Couthon found out. But this was worse than Versailles. The courtiers had been enemies by birth, but the Girondins were his fellow revolutionaries. They preached equality, yet sneered at his broken body. Couthon realized then that to them he would never be a peer, only a cripple. The bitterness was no longer just about class, it was personal betrayal. If they would not respect his mind, he would make them fear his will. From that moment, Couthon became their implacable enemy. He realized that the revolution could not survive if it was led by men who thought themselves better than others. He began to view the Girondins not just as political opponents, but as a cancer. The theoretical hatred Couthon felt for the Girondins was about to manifest as physical force. The legislative maneuvering was over. The time for the pike and the cannon had arrived. Couthon, the man who could not walk, had positioned himself as the immobile center around which the violence of the mob would pivot. He had spent months watching the vultures of the moderate faction circle, but now he was ready to snap the trap shut. The silence of the committee room was about to be shattered by the bells of insurrection. June 2nd, 1793. Paris woke to the sound of the tocsin, the ominous rhythmic ringing of church bells that signaled danger. It was the sound of insurrection. The Tuileries Palace, where the convention sat, was surrounded. 80,000 armed sans-culottes, the radical workers of Paris, encircled the building. They had dragged cannons from the armories. Their fuses were lit. They demanded one thing: the heads of the Girondins. Inside the hall, chaos reigned. The Girondins, pale and trembling, denounced the dictatorship of the mob. They demanded that the soldiers be dispersed. But the soldiers answered only to the radical commune, and by extension to the mountain. In the eye of this hurricane sat Georges Couthon, while other deputies ran to the windows, screaming at the cannons. Couthon remained perfectly still in his wheelchair. He knew this was the end of the game he had been playing for months. The president of the convention, Hérault de Seychelles, attempted to lead the deputies out in a show of defiance. He wanted to prove that the representatives of the people were free. They marched out the front gates only to be met by the terrifying General Henriot. "Gunners, to your pieces!" Henriot roared. The deputies, faced with the black mouths of cannons, retreated in shame back into the hall. They were prisoners. It was Couthon who broke the deadlock. He saw that the convention was paralyzed by fear. He wheeled himself to the tribune. He did not shout. He spoke with a terrifying calmness, almost like a school teacher scolding a class. "Citizens," he said, "all members of the convention must be assured of their liberty. You have marched out to the people. You have found them everywhere good, everywhere generous, everywhere incapable of threatening the security of their delegates. Now that you recognize you are free, I move that we vote on the arrest of the accused deputies." It was a masterstroke of cynical theater. Couthon was telling them, "The mob didn't kill you, so you are free. Now use your freedom to do exactly what the mob wants." Under Couthon's motion, the convention voted to arrest 29 Girondin deputies. The moderate wing of the revolution was severed. The path to dictatorship was clear. Couthon had used the threat of violence to preserve the facade of law. It was the hallmark of his style, tyranny wrapped in the language of procedure. With the Girondins gone, power consolidated into the hands of the Committee of Public Safety. On May 30th, Couthon had been added to this body. Along with Robespierre and the young, fiery Saint-Just, they formed the inner core of the revolution, the triumvirate. They were a strange trinity. Robespierre was the soul, the incorruptible ideologue who provided the moral justification. Saint-Just was the sword, the beautiful, icy young man who led armies and demanded absolute purity. Couthon was the will. He was the administrator, the legal mind, the man who turned the lofty ideals of the other two into concrete decrees. During the summer of 1793, Couthon's health collapsed again. He wrote to his wife that he was spitting blood by the bowlful. He could barely sit upright. Yet, he worked 18 hours a day. He helped draft the Constitution of 1793, a document of radical democracy. It was Couthon's dream, but the dream was put in a coffin almost immediately. The war was going badly. "The Constitution is for peacetime," Saint-Just declared. "The government of France must be revolutionary until the peace." Couthon accepted this. He folded up his beloved Constitution and placed it in a cedar box in the middle of the convention floor, a literal burial of liberty. He accepted that to save the Republic, they had to become tyrants. The fall of the Girondins triggered a civil war. The provinces, tired of being dictated to by the Parisian mob, rose up. The city of Lyon, the second largest city in France and the hub of the silk trade, executed its local Jacobin leader, Joseph Chalier. They declared themselves in rebellion against the convention. This was a dagger in the heart of the Republic. Lyon was a critical strategic point. If it fell to the Royalists, the road to Paris would be open for foreign invasion. The convention was apoplectic. They passed a decree on October 12, 1793, that is unique in the history of warfare. It did not just call for the defeat of Lyon, it called for its erasure. The city of Lyon shall be destroyed. The name of Lyon shall be blotted from the list of the towns of the Republic. The collection of houses remaining shall henceforth bear the name of Ville-Affranchie, liberated city. Couthon was chosen to execute this doom. He was sent as the representative on mission. It was a test. The Angel of Auvergne was being sent to destroy a city of 150,000 people. Couthon arrived at the siege lines in late September. He was in agony, his body strapped into a carriage. The roads were rough, and every bump felt like a knife in his spine. He found an army in disarray. The siege was loose. Supplies were getting into the city. Couthon, despite his lack of military experience, reorganized the lines. He summoned reinforcements, peasant levies from Auvergne, men who spoke his dialect and trusted him. He tightened the noose. On October 9, 1793, the starving city of Lyon surrendered. Couthon entered the city not on a white horse, but carried in a sedan chair. The royalist leaders had fled. The remaining population was terrified. They knew the decree. They expected a massacre. But here Couthon hesitated. He looked at the starving silk weavers. He looked at the magnificent architecture of the Place Bellecour. He remembered his days as the defender of the downtrodden. He realized that destroying Lyon would destroy the economy of the entire region. It was madness, but he had his orders. Robespierre was watching. The mob in Paris was waiting for news of blood. Couthon tried to walk a razor's edge. He decided to destroy the symbols of wealth, but spare the people. He wrote to the convention, "I shall strike the rich, but I shall respect the people in their homes." What followed was one of the most surreal scenes of the revolution. Couthon organized a grand ceremony. He had himself carried to the center of the Place Bellecour, the wealthiest district of Lyon. The facades of the buildings were masterpieces of French architecture. Thousands of troops stood in silence. Couthon was lifted out of his chair. Supported by 2 gendarmes, he hobbled to the wall of the most magnificent mansion. He held a small silver hammer in his hand. He struck the stone wall 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. "I condemn thee to be demolished in the name of the law," he intoned. It was a piece of theater. He didn't blow up the building. He didn't burn the district. He simply marked it. He then ordered hundreds of workers to begin dismantling the facades brick by brick. It was a slow, deliberate process, a demolition by bureaucracy. The pressure mounted. Couthon realized he was losing control of the narrative. He wrote to Saint-Just, "My health is failing. The damp air of the Rhone is killing me." It was a plea to be relieved. He knew what was coming, and he didn't want to be the one to do it. On November 3rd, 1793, Couthon requested his own recall to Paris. The convention agreed. They sent replacements to finish the job, Joseph Fouché and Collot d'Herbois. As Couthon's carriage rolled out of Lyon, he might have told himself he had done his duty. He had conquered the city. He had punished the wicked. But he left the door open for monsters. Collot and Fouché did not use silver hammers. They felt the guillotine was too slow. They marched prisoners, chained together in groups of 60 to the plain of Broteau. They set up cannons loaded with grape shot, bags of scrap metal. They fired point blank into the screaming mass of humanity. Those who weren't killed instantly were finished off with bayonets and sabers. The river Rhone ran red. Nearly 2,000 people were slaughtered in weeks. When Couthon heard of the massacres committed by his replacements in Lyon, he understood the grim lesson of survival. His moderation was viewed not as wisdom, but as weakness. To survive in Paris, the secular saint realized he would have to bury his conscience. He retreated from the public eye, withdrawing into the very nerve center of the terror to construct the true machinery of death, not with silver hammers, but with ink, paper, and cold bureaucratic efficiency. To understand the mechanics of the Great Terror, one must leave the noisy streets and enter a small, stifling room on the second floor of the Tuileries Palace. This was the meeting place of the Committee of Public Safety. It was known as the Green Room because of its green wallpaper and heavy green tablecloth. It was here, under the light of flickering candles, that 12 men decided the fate of millions. The room smelled of wax, stale bread, sweat, and fear. By the winter of 1793, Georges Couthon was a permanent fixture in this room. He was the committee's static center. While other members like Carnot were out inspecting armies, or Jambon Saint-André was inspecting the navy, Couthon was almost always there, seated in his wheelchair at the green table, sorting through mountains of denunciations. His physical condition had deteriorated into a Gothic nightmare. He could no longer move his legs at all. He had to be carried up the stairs by gendarmes every morning, a process that humiliated him deeply. Once in his chair, he would not move for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours. There is a chilling domesticity to the accounts of these evenings. Couthon would often sit for hours, stroking the small spaniel solely devoted to him with one hand, while the other moved across the paper, signing the arrest warrants that would orphan thousands. It was a duality that terrified his contemporaries, the tender master and the ruthless judge existing in the same broken body. The dynamic of the triumvirate had crystallized. Robespierre was the high priest, speaking of virtue and providence. Saint-Just was the executioner, cold and beautiful, rushing to the front lines. But Couthon was the psychologist. He was the one who understood how to manipulate the convention. He was the one who drafted the decrees that made the unthinkable sound legal. He was the revolution's quietest killer, a soft voice directing a hard blade. Visitors to the committee were often disarmed by his gentle melodic tone. He asked about their families. He offered them warm milk, and then, with that same gentle smile, he would sign the paper that sent them to the guillotine. As 1794 dawned, the revolution faced a new crisis. The external armies had been pushed back, but the internal rot was spreading. The Jacobins had split into hostile factions, and the committee was caught in the middle. He found himself fighting a war on two fronts. On the extreme left were the Hebertists, chaotic anarchists who wanted to burn the churches. On the right were the Dantonists, corrupt indulgents who wanted to stop the guillotine. Couthon, the man of rigid order, despised them both. Couthon hated the Hebertists because they were atheists and chaotic, but he hated the Dantonists even more. He viewed Danton, a man of immense physical appetite who ate, drank, and whored with abandon, as the antithesis of virtue. Couthon, trapped in a broken body, despised the gluttony of Danton. How could Danton preach liberty while lining his pockets? To Couthon, the indulgents were not just politically wrong, they were morally leprous. Mercy, Couthon wrote, is a crime when it spares the assassin of the country. The committee struck first at the left. In March 1794, they arrested Hébert and his followers. The trial was a sham, a piece of political theater orchestrated to cleanse the streets. Couthon watched them go to the guillotine with cold satisfaction. But destroying the left only exposed the right. With the extremists gone, the pressure to end the terror mounted. Danton's voice grew louder. "The people want to eat," Danton roared, "and you give them heads." Robespierre hesitated. Danton was his old friend. They had studied together. Camille Desmoulins, Danton's lieutenant, was Robespierre's childhood companion. To kill them would be to kill the heart of the revolution. Couthon had no such hesitation. He saw Robespierre wavering and stiffened his resolve. He reminded the incorruptible that friendship ended where duty began. A pure man, Couthon argued, has no friends but the Republic. The arrest of Danton on the night of March 30th, 1794, was the turning point of the terror. It was the moment the revolution began to eat its own parents. The trial of Danton was a spectacle. Danton was a force of nature. Even from the prisoner's dock, his voice boomed so loud it could be heard across the street. He laughed at the judges. He appealed to the crowd. He was winning. Panic gripped the committee. If Danton was acquitted, he would march on the convention and execute Robespierre and Couthon. It was Couthon and Saint-Just who saved the day for the terror by destroying the law. On April 4th, a letter arrived at the committee claiming that there was a prison plot that Danton's friends were planning to break out. It was a fabrication. Couthon seized upon it. He wheeled himself into the convention, his face a mask of grim determination. He proposed a decree. Any accused person who resists or insults the national justice shall be silenced and tried without debate. It was the decree of outlawry. It was designed specifically to gag Danton. The convention passed it. The order was rushed to the tribunal. The judges read it to Danton. He was silenced. The trial concluded immediately. Verdict: death. On April 5th, Danton, Desmoulins, and their friends were carted to the scaffold. As they passed the house of the Duplays, where Robespierre and Couthon lived, Danton screamed a curse. "Robespierre, you will follow me. Your house will be razed to the ground and salt sown in the earth." Inside the shuttered room, Couthon and Robespierre sat in silence. They had won. They had purified the Republic. But the streets were quieter now. The joy of the revolution was gone. All that was left was the machinery of death. Following the execution of the Dantonists, a strange, suffocating atmosphere descended on Paris. This period, the spring of 1794, is often called the Frozen Revolution. Couthon was now one of the three most powerful men in the world, but he was also dying. The stress of the Danton trial had shattered his health. He could no longer digest solid food. He lived on milk and broth. He was carried everywhere. Yet, he became even more obsessive about his work. He began to envision a France completely purged of the old ways. On May 23rd and 24th, assassination attempts were made against Robespierre and Collot d'Herbois. Paranoia exploded. The committee believed there was a vast foreign conspiracy. They needed a weapon to strike back, faster, harder, and with less friction. Robespierre turned to Couthon. "We need a law," he said, "a law that removes the obstacles." Couthon went to work. He retired to the country estate of the committee, but he did not rest. He wrote. He used his legal brilliance, honed in the courts of Auvergne, to deconstruct the very idea of justice. He drafted the law of 22nd Prairial. It was a document of terrifying simplicity. It expanded the definition of enemy of the people to include almost anyone who criticized the state. It abolished the right to a defense counsel. It abolished the need for witnesses. The conscience of the juror was evidence enough. It left the jury with only two verdicts: acquittal or death. Prison was no longer an option. When Couthon presented this law to the convention on June 10, 1794, the deputies gasped. They realized immediately what it meant. It was a blank check for murder. One deputy, Rouamps, shouted, "If this law passes, we might as well blow our brains out here and now." Couthon was unfazed. He sat in his chair looking at them with his large, sad eyes. The delay for punishing the enemies of the fatherland should not be greater than the time it takes to recognize them, he said softly. It is not a question of punishing them, but of annihilating them. The convention, cowed by the looming shadow of the guillotine, passed the law. With the law of 22 Prairial enacted, the last legal levees holding back the flood of violence collapsed. Couthon had handed the tribunal a weapon of mass destruction, stripping away the safeguards of justice in the name of speed. The ink on the decree was barely dry before the consequences began to spill into the streets. What followed was not a judicial process, but a mechanized purge, a season of blood that would stain the cobblestones of Paris and mark the summer of 1794 as the darkest chapter of the Revolution. The passing of the Law of 22. Prairial unleashed a horror that Paris had never seen and would never see again. Historians call this period the Great Terror, but to those living through it, it was simply the Red Summer. The heat in Paris that June and July was oppressive. The sky was a hazy, stagnant yellow. The air hung heavy with the smells of the tannery, the open sewers, and increasingly the metallic tang of blood. Under Couthon's law, the legal machinery became a slaughterhouse. The Revolutionary Tribunal, stripped of the burden of defense lawyers and witnesses, began to process human beings like cattle. The trials were no longer investigations. They were roll calls. The numbers are staggering. In the 13 months preceding the Law of 22 Prairial, the tribunal had delivered 1,220 death sentences. In the 49 days following Couthon's law, they delivered 1,376. The executioner, Sanson, complained that the guillotine was overheating. The blade became dull. The ground beneath the scaffold at the Place du Trône Renversé could not absorb the blood fast enough. The executioners had to dig a trench to drain it into the sewer. And where was the architect of this nightmare? Georges Couthon sat in the green room of the Tuileries, his paralyzed legs wrapped in flannel, methodically reviewing the lists. He was not a sadist in the traditional sense. He did not go to watch the executions. He viewed them as a surgeon views an amputation, gruesome but necessary to save the patient. The Republic. While the guillotine worked outside, a silent, deadly war was raging inside the government. The Committee of Public Safety, the executive, was fracturing. Robespierre, exhausted and paranoid, stopped attending meetings in late June. He retreated to his room, leaving Couthon and Saint-Just to manage the wolves. Couthon became the de facto eyes and ears of the triumvirate, but he was surrounded by enemies. Lazare Carnot, the organizer of Victory, hated Couthon. He called him a soft tyrant. Billaud-Varenne and Collot d'Herbois hated Robespierre's moralizing. The flashpoint was the Bureau of General Police. This was a new department created by Saint-Just and overseen by Couthon. The Committee of General Security, the police arm of the government, saw this as a hostile takeover. They believed Couthon was building a private spy network to gather dirt on other deputies. They were right. Couthon was gathering dirt. He sat in his wheelchair, collecting dossiers on corruption, preparing for the next purge. The advocate of the poor had become the Grand Inquisitor. In early July, Couthon attempted to flee the madness. The pain in his legs was becoming unbearable. The spasms were so violent they nearly threw him from his chair. He traveled to a country estate near Chaville, hoping the fresh air would revive him. It was a surreal interlude. While Paris choked on blood, Couthon sat in a garden smelling the roses, playing with his son, and writing tender letters to his wife. "I am breathing better here," he wrote. "Nature is the only true healer." But he could not escape. The couriers arrived daily with news from Paris. Robespierre sent urgent messages. "Come back. They are plotting against us." Couthon returned to the city on July 23rd, 5th Thermidor. He looked like a ghost. His skin was translucent, his eyes sunken. He had to be carried into the Jacobin Club. At the club, he delivered a speech that sealed his fate. He didn't speak of reconciliation. He spoke of a new purification. He told the Jacobins that there were 5 or 6 small vipers in the convention who needed to be crushed. The audience cheered, but the deputies in the back of the room went cold. They knew Couthon wasn't speaking metaphorically. 5 or 6 meant them. The catastrophe arrived on July 26, 1794, 8 Thermidor. Robespierre returned to the convention after weeks of absence. He marched to the tribune, Couthon watching from his wheelchair at the foot of the mountain, and delivered a 2-hour speech. It was a masterpiece of vagueness. Robespierre denounced a criminal coalition within the government. He threatened everyone but named no one. "Who are the guilty?" the deputies shouted. "Name them." Robespierre refused. "I will not name them yet," he said. This terrified everyone. The corrupt Fouché, the violent Collot, the moderate Boissy, they all looked at each other and realized, if we don't kill him today, he kills us tomorrow. The night of 8th, Thermidor was a restless vigil for the conspirators and the accused alike. While Couthon slept, or tried to, amidst the spasms of his illness, the disparate enemies of the triumvirate were forging their alliance of fear in the shadows. The threat had been made, the lines drawn. As the sun rose on the morning of the 9th, the humidity pressing down on Paris like a physical weight, the time for speeches and threats had passed. Couthon wheeled himself toward the convention one last time, unaware that the floor he rolled upon was already crumbling beneath him. The session of the convention on 9th and Thermidor, July 27, 1794, began at noon. The air in the hall was suffocatingly hot. Couthon sat in his wheelchair at the base of the tribune, his spaniel panting at his feet. He looked up at the sea of faces and saw something he hadn't seen in months. Defiance. Saint-Just took the podium. He was dressed in his customary elegance, a beige coat and white cravat. He began to speak in his cool metallic voice. "I am of no faction," Saint-Just began. "I will fight them all." He never finished the third sentence. Jean Lambert Tallien, a corrupt deputy who had been sleeping with a distinct lack of virtue, jumped up. "I ask that the curtain be torn away," he screamed. It was the signal. The hall erupted. "Down with the tyrant," came the chant. Robespierre rushed to the podium, shoving Saint-Just aside. He tried to speak, but the president of the convention, Collot d'Herbois, rang his bell incessantly, drowning out the incorruptible's voice. It was a cacophony of hatred. And Couthon? He sat frozen in the eye of the storm. For the first time, his paralysis was not just a physical hindrance. It was a political cage. In the chaos of a riot, a man in a wheelchair is invisible. He watched as his friends were shouted down. The shouting lasted for hours. Finally, a virtually unknown deputy named Louchet stammered out the fatal proposition: "I demand the decree of accusation against Robespierre." The motion was seconded immediately, but then eyes turned to the wheelchair. Couthon was not merely an accomplice. To many, he was the brain behind the law of 22 Prairial. "And Couthon," someone shouted, "and Saint-Just." Couthon did not beg. He did not cry. He looked at the men he had worked with, the men whose lives he had spared or condemned. He saw the hypocrisy of it all. These men weren't killing him because they loved liberty. They were killing him to save their own skins. As the gendarmes moved to arrest him, Couthon uttered a line of biting sarcasm. He looked at his withered legs and then at the armed guards approaching him. "It is a coup for cowards," he sneered. "You triumph over a man who cannot even stand to face you." The events of the night of 9th of Thermidor are among the most chaotic in history. The prisoners were taken to different jails, but were released by loyalist troops from the Paris Commune. In a surreal twist, the arrested men found themselves free again. They were taken to the Hôtel de Ville, City Hall. Inside the Hôtel de Ville, the triumvirate hesitated. Couthon was carried up the grand staircase. He was in agony. The rough handling by the guards had aggravated his condition. He was placed on a table in the council room. They had the power to start a civil war. Henriot, the commander of the National Guard, was drunk and shouting for blood. But Robespierre and Couthon were lawyers. They believed in the law. To march on the convention was illegal. It was a coup d'etat. They paralyzed themselves with legalism while their enemies sharpened their knives. As the night wore on, the heavens opened. A massive thunderstorm broke over Paris. The rain lashed down, scattering the sans-culottes who were waiting in the square. They went home. The triumvirate was left alone. At 2 a.m., the convention struck back. Troops led by Barras and Léonard Bourdon stormed the Hôtel de Ville. They smashed through the doors. What they found inside was a tableau of Gothic horror. Robespierre was sitting at a table with a shattered jaw from a pistol shot. Lebas had blown his own brains out. Saint-Just stood silently before a painting of the rights of man. And Couthon? The troops found him at the bottom of a stone staircase. Some say that, in a desperate attempt to escape or commit suicide, he threw himself down the stairs. Others say that the invading soldiers, seeing the monster in the wheelchair, tipped him over and threw him down like a sack of garbage. He was found lying in a pool of blood. His forehead was gashed open. He was not dead, but he was severely injured. He lay there for some time playing dead, hoping to be overlooked. But a soldier kicked him. Couthon groaned. "The little monster is still alive," they shouted. They did not pick him up gently. They dragged him by his heels. His paralyzed legs bumped against the stone steps. He was thrown onto a stretcher and carted to the Tuileries, where he was dumped on a table alongside the shattered Robespierre. For hours, Couthon lay on that table in the antechamber of the Committee of Public Safety, the very room where he had ruled France just days before. July 28, 1794. The prisoners were taken to the conciergerie for identification. Since they had been declared outlaws, there was no trial, just death. They were loaded into the tumbrils. It was a carnival atmosphere. Couthon was in the first cart, slumped against the side. The jolting of the wooden wheels over the cobblestones must have been excruciating for his condition. They arrived at the Place de la Révolution. Couthon was the first of the leaders to be executed, but here the machinery of death failed. The guillotine was designed for a standing man. Couthon was a cripple. His legs were fused in a sitting position, drawn up tight against his chest by years of atrophy and contracture. He could not straighten his legs. He could not lie flat. For a reported 15 minutes of agonizing delay, the crowd watched a gruesome struggle. The executioners pushed, pulled, and strapped his rigid limbs with agonizing pressure, trying to force a body that could not bend into a yoke designed for the standing. It was a spectacle of brute force against biological ruin. Couthon, who had borne his illness with stoicism for years, finally broke. He screamed. It was a raw animal sound of pain. "You are hurting me," he cried out. "You are tearing me apart." Finally, the executioners managed to wrench his body into a contorted angle, pressing his head down with immense force. The blade fell. The scream was cut short. The head of the vengeful lawyer tumbled into the basket. The physical destruction of Georges Couthon was complete. His broken body discarded in a lime pit to rot with the very men he had condemned. But for his executioners, the death of the man was not enough. They needed to kill his ghost. As the tumbrils rolled away and the dust settled on the Place de la Révolution, A new campaign began, one not of blades, but of words. The victors of Thermidor set out to rewrite the history they had just survived, ensuring that the advocate of the poor would be remembered only as a monster, burying the complexity of his tragedy under a century of myths. The blade had fallen, but the assassination of Georges Couthon's character was only just beginning. In the days following 10th Thermidor, a strange phenomenon occurred in Paris. The men who had overthrown Robespierre, Tallien, Fouché, Barras, were not heroes. They were butchers who had been just as bloody, if not bloodier, than the men they executed. To survive, they needed to convince France that they had not been accomplices to the terror, but victims of it. They needed a scapegoat. And Couthon, with his twisted body in his wheelchair, was the perfect villain. The Thermidorian propaganda machine went into overdrive. They could not paint Couthon as a man. That would make him too sympathetic. They had to paint him as a creature. Pamphlets flooded the streets describing Couthon not as a misguided lawyer, but as a tiger. They invented grotesque lies. One popular rumor claimed that Couthon kept a pet octopus or a tiger cub in his office, which he fed with the blood of executed prisoners. They attacked his disability with vicious cruelty. They claimed his paralysis was not a medical condition, but a physical manifestation of his rotten soul. They argued that because he could not enjoy the physical pleasures of life, walking, dancing, loving, he had decided to destroy life itself out of pure envy. While Paris celebrated the end of the terror with dancing and wine, a small apartment on the Rue Saint-Honoré was plunged into silence. Marie Brunel Couthon, the gentle wife who had nursed Georges through his years of agony, was left alone. The brutality of the reaction against Couthon's family was absolute. Their property was confiscated. Marie was left destitute. She was arrested shortly after the coup, thrown into the very prisons her husband had filled. She held her young son, Antoine, close to her chest, waiting for her name to be called. But the bloodlust had sated itself on the leaders. The wives were eventually released. Marie emerged into a France that hated her name. She returned to Auvergne, but there was no peace there. The local population, who had once cheered Couthon as their savior, now spat on his memory. She lived the rest of her life in crushing poverty and anonymity. For 2 centuries, historians simply repeated the 18th century diagnosis of Couthon's illness: bad humors or the result of excesses. But modern medical historians have looked closer at the symptoms described in Couthon's letters: the progressive loss of sensation in the legs, the sharp shooting pains, the muscle atrophy, the eventual complete paralysis, and the fact that his mind remained sharp until the end. The most likely diagnosis is tuberculous meningitis, or Pott's disease, tuberculosis of the spine. If this is true, it adds a layer of excruciating physical context to his actions. Pott's disease is known to be agonizing. The vertebrae slowly collapse, compressing the spinal cord. It causes spasms, fever, and night sweats. When Couthon was sitting in the Committee of Public Safety drafting the law of 22nd Prairial, he was likely in a state of septic delirium, his body fighting a massive bacterial infection, his pain receptors firing constantly. The opium he took to manage the pain would have clouded his judgment, inducing states of paranoia and detachment. It does not excuse the mass murder, but it humanizes the horror. Today in the Musée Carnavalet in Paris, you can still see it. The fauteuil à tricycle, Couthon's wheelchair, it sits empty today. A jarring artifact of velvet luxury and mechanical necessity. It is the throne of the soft monster, a silent witness to the fact that the darkest orders in history were not shouted by a giant, but whispered by a broken man in a chair. Why does Georges Couthon matter? We study Robespierre for his ideology. We study Danton for his charisma. But we should study Couthon for his fragility. He represents the terrifying slippery slope of good intentions. He began as the best of men, kind, charitable, a defender of the weak. He ended as a tyrant. He did not wake up one day and decide to be evil. He was eroded. He was eroded by the rejection of the aristocracy, by the pain of his body, by the fear of invasion, and by the toxic echo chamber of the committee. He teaches us that virtue without mercy is a butcher's knife. He teaches us that when we view our political opponents as diseases to be cured rather than humans to be debated, we are already strapping ourselves into the executioner's chair. In the end, Couthon wanted to heal France, but because he was broken, he believed the only way to heal the patient was to kill it. The mist still clings to the volcanic hills of Orsay in Auvergne. The house where he was born is gone. The grave where he lies is unmarked. But the lesson of the advocate of the poor remains, written in the ink of the treaty and the blood of the battlefield. Beware the man who believes he is the only one who can save you, for he will burn the world to prove he is right.